And for a moment he realized how much his mother had taken on. Her own worries, his heartbreak, the quiet weight of a house that felt emptier than it used to. Without thinking, he stepped behind her and wrapped his arms around her shoulders in a gentle hug. Not out of sadness but out of gratitude for everything she had held together while he fell apart. She stiffened for just a second, as though the sudden warmth surprised her, then slowly relaxed into the embrace, her hands still damp from the sink. But instead of the soft reassurance he expected, she let out a shaky breath that made him pull back just enough to see her face. Her expression was strange, tender, scared, and burdened with something she had clearly held inside for a long time. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling in a way he hadn't heard before. "There's something you need to know. Something I should have told you a long time ago." His heart jumped, not in fear but in a sharp, confused rush of emotion. The kind that happens when life suddenly feels like it's about to change direction. "Mom, what are you talking about?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady even though he felt the floor shift under him. She turned off the faucet, dried her hands slowly, and looked at him with eyes full of regret and love tangled together. "Not here," she said softly. "Sit with me." The way she spoke made him realize this wasn't about a simple memory or a forgotten detail. It was something deeper, something connected to the months he'd spent hurting and pretending he wasn't. As they moved toward the dining table, the air between them felt charged, as if every quiet moment of the past year had been leading up to this one. Ethan sat down, waiting, his mind racing but his voice quiet, wanting to understand, bracing without knowing why. And in that stillness, in that breath before the truth, he felt the faintest tug of fate, like this was the moment everything might finally make sense, or fall apart, or both at once. Linda sat across from Ethan at the small dining table, the warm tea between them going cold as the truth she'd been holding for months finally pressed its way to the surface. She looked nervous in a way he wasn't used to, hands trembling slightly, eyes soft but troubled, as if she feared what her words might do to him. Ethan waited, trying to stay calm, but the tension in the room made every second feel sharper than the last. Finally she spoke, her voice careful and quiet. She said she had watched him struggle ever since Emily left, watched him pretend he was strong while carrying a heartbreak that seemed to follow him everywhere. And she said it with such gentle honesty that Ethan didn't know whether to look away or hold her gaze. He opened his mouth to tell her he was fine, but she shook her head, cutting off the lie before it could form. "Ethan, this isn't just about you being hurt," she said. "It's about something I kept from you because I thought it was the right choice at the time, but now I see that it wasn't." Before he could ask what she meant, she slid open the drawer beside her and pulled out an old, wrinkled envelope, one that looked like it had been handled too many times, folded again and again, almost like someone couldn't let it go. The sight of it hit something deep inside him, stirring confusion, fear, and a faint spark of hope he didn't want to feel. Linda placed the letter in front of him, her voice lowering as if the air itself might break. She said it had come the week after Emily left, addressed to him. Ethan blinked, stunned. A letter? From Emily? He stared at it, trying to understand. Why would his mother have it? Why hadn't he seen it before? Linda explained that Emily had asked her not to give it to him, said she wanted to protect him, said she wasn't strong enough to talk to him directly but didn't want him to think she'd vanished without meaning. His heart pounded, torn between anger and painful curiosity. Linda admitted she had kept the letter because she sincerely believed Emily might come back when things settled, and she hadn't wanted to reopen Ethan's wounds if the letter only made things worse. She had carried the weight of that decision ever since. Ethan took the letter, feeling the fragile paper tremble in his hand, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. All the unanswered questions, the sleepless nights, the confusion that had wrapped around him for months. Suddenly it all narrowed to this one thin envelope. He unfolded it slowly, bracing himself for whatever truth waited inside. But before his eyes could reach the first line, before he could read even a single word, a sudden knock echoed through the quiet house. It wasn't loud, but it was firm enough to snap both of them out of the moment. Linda looked toward the door, surprised. Ethan stood up, the letter still in his hand, his pulse picking up. Then a voice came from outside. Familiar, soft, unsure. A voice that belonged to a past he had tried to move on from. "Ethan?" the voice called gently through the door. "Are you home?" Ethan froze, the sound hitting him like a wave, scattering everything inside him. Hurt, hope, fear, confusion. It couldn't be. It had been over a year. But there it was. Emily's voice. Her voice, right outside his front door. Ethan walked toward the door with his heart beating too fast, his hand still gripping the letter like it might slip away if he let it go. The house felt different now, the air heavy with shock and a strange, painful hope he didn't trust. When he opened the door, the cold wind rushed in first, carrying the smell of winter and the sound of soft breathing, and then there she was, Emily, standing on the porch like she had stepped out of a memory he had spent a year trying to bury. Her hair was damp from the falling snow, her cheeks pink from the cold, and her eyes, the same gentle hazel he once knew so well, looked at him with a mix of fear and longing, as if she wasn't sure she had the right to be there. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice shaking just enough for him to hear how nervous she was. "I didn't know if you'd even open the door." He couldn't speak at first. He wasn't sure what emotion to choose, relief, anger, shock, or that ache that had never fully left. Behind him, Linda appeared for just a moment, her face soft with something between hope and worry. She touched Ethan's arm lightly and murmured, "I'll give you two some space," then stepped back into the hallway, disappearing around the corner. Ethan and Emily stood there in the doorway, not quite inside, not quite outside, like the threshold itself held its breath. Emily's gaze dropped to the letter in his hand, and her expression changed, hurt mixed with acceptance. "So, she finally gave it to you," she said quietly. Ethan swallowed hard. "You knew she would one day?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady even though he felt anything but steady inside. Emily nodded gently. "I hoped she would," she said. "Because I couldn't say everything I needed to say back then. I didn't leave because I stopped caring, Ethan. That wasn't it at all." The wind pushed at them again, and Ethan motioned for her to step inside. She did, brushing snow off her coat as she entered, and the door closed behind them with a soft thud, sealing the world outside and leaving them in a silence that carried 1,000 unspoken things. Ethan looked at her carefully, noticing the small changes, the tiredness around her eyes, the way she held herself as if she was carrying something heavy, something she had held alone for too long. "Why are you here?" he asked, not harshly, but with the raw honesty of someone who deserved answers. Emily took a breath, her hands trembling at her sides. "Because I owe you the truth," she said. "All of it. And because I couldn't keep pretending that walking away was the best thing for you." Ethan felt the sting of those words, the way they reopened a wound he thought had finally begun to close. "You owed me honesty back then," he said, his voice low. "I waited for you. I waited a long time." Emily's eyes filled with remorse, not dramatic or forced but quiet and real. "I know," she whispered. "And I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm just asking for a chance to explain." She stepped closer, not too close, just enough for him to see how hard it was for her to stand there. "I didn't leave because of us," she continued. "I left because something happened. Something I didn't know how to handle. And I was scared it would pull you away from your future, your plans, everything you worked for." Ethan frowned, confused, but before he could ask, a sudden gust of wind blew through the small gap in the doorframe, slamming the door shut with a sharp, echoing crack that made both of them jump. The sound seemed to underline the tension in the room, trapping them in a moment where the past and present collided all at once. Emily glanced at the door, then back at him, and for the first time since she arrived, she looked like someone who wasn't sure she deserved to stay. "Ethan," she said softly, "if you want me to leave after you read the letter, I will. I just couldn't let another year go by without trying to make things right." Ethan stared at her, breathing hard, overwhelmed by everything. The letter, the unexpected knock, the sudden return of a person he had convinced himself he needed to stop loving. "I don't know what to feel right now," he admitted, the honesty slipping out before he could stop it. "I don't know if this is a mistake or a second chance or something in between." Emily nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then let's take it one truth at a time," she said. The room felt charged again, like something important had shifted, like fate had paused just long enough to give them both one more moment to figure out what came next. Ethan and Emily stood in the quiet hallway with the door now closed behind them, the sound of the outside world fading until all that remained was the soft hum of the heater and the uneven rhythm of their breathing. She looked smaller than he remembered, not physically but emotionally, as if life had pressed too much weight onto her shoulders, and he couldn't decide if seeing her again made his heart lighter or heavier. Emily wiped a thin layer of melted snow from her sleeve, trying to steady herself before she spoke, but her voice still shook when the words finally came out. She told him that she hadn't left because she stopped loving him, or because she lost interest, but because her father had fallen seriously ill, and she was suddenly pulled into a life she didn't know how to handle. She didn't want Ethan to give up his job offers, his future, the plans they had talked about so many times, and she believed that if she told him the truth, he would sacrifice everything to stay with her, something she didn't want him to regret years later. Ethan listened, not interrupting, his fingers tight around the letter as he tried to process the explanation he had once begged for. Hearing it now made something inside him twist: relief at finally knowing the truth, frustration at being shut out, and sadness for the pain she had gone through alone. He closed his eyes for a moment and whispered that she should have trusted him, that he deserved to choose for himself instead of being pushed away without a word. Emily nodded, tears gathering but not falling, her voice soft as she admitted she had made the wrong choice, that she had been overwhelmed and scared, and she had convinced herself disappearing was the kindest option even though it broke her too. For a long moment they stood without speaking, the truth settling between them like a heavy but necessary weight, and Ethan felt something inside him loosen. Not forgiveness, not yet, but an understanding he hadn't been ready for before. From the hallway, Linda watched them quietly, her face warm and hopeful, not wanting to interrupt but unable to hide the small smile that came from seeing her son finally face the truth he'd needed. Ethan looked at Emily again, taking in the quiet sincerity in her eyes, and he admitted he didn't know what would happen next. Didn't know if they would rebuild anything or simply find closure after all this time. Emily nodded with relief rather than disappointment and said she wasn't asking for a second chance. She wasn't expecting him to open his arms and pretend nothing had happened. She only wanted honesty between them again, to repair at least the part of their story that ended too painfully. Ethan breathed deeply, feeling the weight of the letter, and finally said they could start there, with truth, with conversation, with small steps that didn't demand anything more than clarity. Emily's shoulders lowered in quiet gratitude, the tension melting from her face. They walked toward the living room, not as a couple reunited, but as two people ready to confront the past instead of running from it. And as they sat down, the night felt different. Not heavy, not broken, but open in a way that hinted at something new. Maybe healing, maybe closure, maybe a beginning that didn't have to look like the past. Whatever it was, Ethan felt ready to face it, and for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like something he had to fear.